Hello and welcome back. Today, as promised, I'm doing a tutorial on Wideview, which is one of the solutions that you can use to create a multi-channel sim setup where you use multiple PCs to actually run the simulation software and share the load between them. So a few months back I did a video on setting up Prepar3d's multi-channel feature and creating a multi-channel cluster using the built-in mechanism. And that was quite well received, and I had a few comments on there asking me to make a similar video for Wideview, and that's what I'm doing today. As far as the Prepar3d multi-channel setup goes, go watch that video if you're at all interested in that side of things. But the long and the short of it is that I certainly have experienced fairly poor performance, particularly on the client PCs, and it's obviously very expensive to buy and set up. So I recommend Wideview as a good solution, which is one that I use in my own cockpit. Whilst it does have limitations compared to Prepar3d's multi-channel, it does get the job done, and it does most of what you want. So let's drill into Wideview a bit more and see what it does. Here we are on the Wideview web page. You can see that there are a few other utilities produced by the maker of Wideview, Luciano Napolitano. Of those, the only one I've used is Key to Mouse, which is quite useful. I'm also looking at the Key to LAN utility, possibly for a future project, but we're going to concentrate on Wideview today. So if we have a look at the Wideview page, you can see actually a note to say Luciano is currently looking into and working on a version of Wideview that works with MSFS, or FS 2020 as people insist on calling it, even though it isn't. And that's good to hear, given how these things work and given that MSFS has SimConnect on board. It's quite likely that Wideview could be ported without too much difficulty. That's not going to fix the problems with the view system that make home cockpits quite difficult, but it would certainly be a good step in the right direction, so I should be keeping an eye out for that. However, this is not currently in Microsoft Flight Simulator channel. It is pretty much focused on Prepared, and that's where I'm going to be doing all of the tutorial setup today. First thing you need to do if you want to use Wideview, of course, is to download it, and you can do that from this page. You can download it here from this link, and that takes you to a page with all the download links on. You don't need to purchase before you download. You can download it, you can trial it out. The restriction is that Wideview will only work for 10 minutes at each simulator startup. So when you start the sim, you start your first flight, Wideview will function for 10 minutes, then it will time out and stop, and then you will need to restart the simulator if you want to test Wideview again. But 10 minutes is really enough to get a good view as to whether it will work for you and to understand how it all hangs together, and then you can go away and purchase when you're ready to. And that can be done from this link here. Note there is also another utility in the family called Widetraffic, and Widetraffic does what it sounds like it does, which is it synchronizes the AI or multiplayer traffic from your host simulator to your client simulations, however many of them you might have, and make sure that you have the same aircraft flying in the same place at the same time. So if you buy Wideview, then you might also wish to buy Widetraffic. It just depends on whether or not you care about AI traffic in your sim. I do, therefore I have Widetraffic. If we go to the download page, you can see there are several different versions to download, so make sure you get the right one. So this is the version that you'll want to download if you are using Prepared v4 or v5, which I imagine most of you are doing. That's the version that was released in April this year and is now Prepar3d v5 compatible. And the same for Widetraffic. The Widetraffic 64 version is downloadable here. Underneath though, you can see older versions. So if you are still running Prepared v3, or even earlier, or if you are running FSX, or FSX Steam Edition, or indeed ESP, if anybody in the world is still running ESP, this is the one that you'd want to download and use. You can actually have mixed networks if you want, so you could have, for example, Prepared on your host and FSX on your clients. No real reason why you'd want to, except possibly licensing, and obviously things would look quite different across the different machines, but it is technically possible with Wideview, which is something you can't do with Prepar3d's multi-channel. And there's also an earlier version of Widetraffic for those platforms, and finally there is a version of Wideview, but not Widetraffic, for Microsoft Flight Sim 2004 and 2002. So if you are running very old versions of the sim, and I know there are still quite a few sims out there running on FS 2004, because you have aircraft or other tech that just doesn't work with FSX, then you can still take advantage of Wideview. Unfortunately, there is no version of Widetraffic that works for you. Okay, so this is Neil from the future breaking into the video. After I finished making the video, I realized I hadn't said a great deal about the software licensing. And actually, I think it's really important that people understand the licensing implications of going for a multi-channel system. So in a nutshell, this is what it means. Every copy of Prepared that you run, whether it's on the host or on your client machines, needs to be licensed and activated. It's not like P3D's built-in multi-channel situation where you pay only for the host and all of the clients can run without further activation. Don't forget, when you buy Professional Plus, you're spending a great deal more money, so Lockheed Martin doesn't feel like they're losing out on any revenue by letting you run the clients for free. When you're running Wideview, you'll just be using a regular professional or academic copy of Prepared, and so every copy that you have running needs to be activated or else things just are not going to work. Secondly, think about the add-ons that you have. Every piece of scenery that you wish to show in your sim is going to need to be installed on the host and on all of the client machines. You need to check the licensing agreement for the scenery and see what it says about installation, whether you can do so on multiple machines or whether it's limited to a single PC only. And if it is, then again, you should buy additional licenses for all of that scenery in order to be correctly licensed. I think it's very important that you are correctly licensed and you don't rip off creators, because although it can get quite expensive, they do deserve to be compensated for their work. The same also applies to aircraft. If you are going to run Wideview with the virtual cockpit on, so you need to display the virtual cockpit of the aircraft or any of the special effects that come with the aircraft, you're going to need those aircraft installed on all of your client machines as well as your host machine, and you may well need to buy additional licenses for that as well. As always, you need to check the license agreement. On the other hand, if you're using Wideview just to generate an outside cockpit view without a virtual cockpit, then you don't need to install the aircraft on all the client machines. You can just use Wideview's built-in dummy aircraft, which I do talk about a little bit later in this video, and that will get you what you need. So you can save some cost there. But multi-channel does come with a cost. It's something you need to be aware of. I would read all the license agreements for all the software that you plan on using, calculate the cost out before you take any actual action, before you build additional PCs, before you buy Wideview, and before you do any setup, because if that cost is going to be a problem, you need to know about that up front. So with all that said, back to the video. So download from here, and then if and when you're ready later on to buy, you can come back here and click on the Buy Now button, and that will take you to this My Commerce site, used to be Share It, where you have all the pricing. As you can see, the prices are quite reasonable, and the licensing is actually pretty simple. You have to buy a license for the machine acting as the host in the network, but then any other machines you can install Wideview, Widetraffic onto those and run them as clients without any additional payment. So it's just the one license fee. So compared to P3D multi-channel, it's a very good deal indeed. Okay, so let's assume that you've gone ahead and downloaded Wideview and Widetraffic, if you want that, to your PC. Now you need to install them. It's a pretty straightforward normal Windows installer. I'm not going to walk you through that whole process. It's very straightforward, so just go ahead and do that. And then we can have a look at how it's actually set up on the machines. So let me bring up these two windows. So these are my two machines. This is my host machine on the left. This is my client machine on the right now. At some point I may end up with more client machines, but for right now I just have the one client with the one host. So if I bring up the menu here and go into Windows Explorer, and then we go into this folder, which is where all the config files are stored for Prepared. And you can see the add-ons.config is there, the prepared.config is there. DLL.XML is the one that we care about. DLL.XML, you know, is where various add-ons register themselves. These days, most things have moved to the add-on XML method, but not Widetraffic and Wideview. I don't believe you can do them as add-on XML. and if you can, then I'm really not bothered with trying, since this just works fine. But it will install itself into your DLL XML file. I think, like you can see here, there is my wide traffic and my Wideview 64 entries, and it just points to the DLL that actually runs the software. And in terms of where you'll find those DLLs, if we navigate down to the actual flight sim directory, then you have folders created, Wideview 64 and then the wide traffic 64, and they both look very similar. They have the DLL, which is used to actually move the add-on into the simulator, and then they also have uninstall, so that you can uninstall it. There's a README, there's a manual. The manual is definitely worth reading, by the way. It gives you a great deal of detail, more detail than I'm going to be able to give you in this tutorial. And then there is this, the booster64.exe. Wide traffic has something similar. I think it's called, well, I can't remember what it's called. Let's have a look. Yeah, WT64 process 64.exe. These programs are actually part of Wideview, and they're part of the system for network comms. So you will see them on the desktop. They have just little windows of their own, blank windows. Don't close them. Really don't close them, because things will go wrong if you do. Just leave them to run. They will start at startup and you can safely ignore them. Okay, so you've got Wideview and perhaps wide traffic set up and running. And it needs to be on all of your machines, of course, not just on the host, but also on the client. If we bring up the menu bars on the host and the client and go to the add-ons menu, you will see that there are now menu entries for wide traffic on Wideview, and that's on both machines. Now, the menu system is completely the same, regardless of whether it's the server or the client, but some of the options are only relevant to the client and some of them are only relevant to the server. You'll also notice that we are in the same location with the same aircraft. However, the attentive among you may notice that on the host here I'm at stand 48 and on the client I'm at stand 46, and that's just because I repositioned this aircraft at an earlier stage, but I didn't make that change on the scenario that I saved on the client machine. And that's a good way of demonstrating how Wideview will synchronize your position, your location, and the date and time. So let me turn Wideview on. Now I run with Wideview not set to start when the simulator starts. That is the default, that it will start, but I've turned that off. And the reason why is because I want to be able to do some setup work over on the client machine before I actually enable Wideview, because Wideview will then go through that process of synchronizing the location and the date time, which may well cause the whole scenario to load again. And I have had some problems with that in terms of the sim crashing, so I prefer to get both sims into essentially the same place before I turn Wideview on. But when I do turn Wideview on, and I'll start it here, if you watch the machine on the right, now it's actually going to reload. So there must be a substantial difference in terms of date time. If there were not, if the sims were both at approximately the same date and time, and it was just the location that had moved, given it's only a tiny move, then the aircraft would just have warped straight across to stand 48. In this case it's not, it's actually reloading, but never mind. We'll just wait for that to reload. Okay, so the client is now reloaded. You can see we're now in exactly the same place on both machines, and the date and time is also synchronized. The weather is also synchronized, but that is purely by accident, in the sense that both scenarios were saved with the same weather settings. Right, let's have a look at those config menus, and we'll just skim over the important things. Note that you can manually update client date time here if it gets out of sync. It's unusual, but if it does, you can update the weather manually if enabled. But you do have to set up the way that weather is updated. You can load a different flight. This will actually load any of the saved scenarios, and it will also cause the other machine to load the same scenario, but you must copy the scenario file and any flight plan from the host machine onto the client machines. It doesn't magically transfer that data over the network. So I've never used that feature. I don't bother with it, but if you do, then you need to know that. We have weather options, which is actually talking about how to set up the weather, and we'll look at that in a minute. We have configure, which is the main configuration dialog. We have a view setup, which as it sounds has to do with setting up views. And we have an option to shut down clients, in which case it will actually send a shutdown message to all your client machines. This is designed for operations where you don't routinely have a keyboard or mouse connected to the client machines, and you just have them start up automatically and join the multi-channel network via Wideview, and then you can shut them down later. And then there's obviously an about box and also registration. So if you were not registered, and of course I am, then you would get a larger dialog here where you could actually put in your registration key and get it validated. So let's have a look at the configuration dialog, because that's probably the most important one that you would need to know about. Let's bring it up also on the other machine. Oh, but let's actually bring up the Wideview configuration, not the Widetraffic configuration. There we go. Alright, that's slightly better. So you can see that the configuration dialog looks the same on both server and client, and only some of the options on this dialog are relevant to the servers, and some to the clients, and some to both. So the most important one is right underneath the buttons here is the actual role. So this one's been set as the server, which tells it that not only that it is the server, but also that it needs to be licensed. So if you turned it on without licensing, that's the point at which it would ask you to activate. Over here on the client, I've got the role set as client, so it knows it doesn't need to be activated, and so it doesn't make any kind of fuss about the fact that it doesn't have a key installed. Start from the top left then. These options are relevant to both server and clients. The priority is actually the Windows scheduler priority of the Wideview thread. I don't know how much you will know about Windows thread scheduling, but any thread can have, well, process actually can have a priority from low to max like that. Most things are launched with normal priority, as would make sense, but Wideview is automatically elevated up to max priority. This means that the operating system will give it time ahead of pretty much anything else, and that's necessary to maintain a smooth update. However, it may have an impact on your sim if you are very, very CPU bound, so you might consider bringing it down a notch just to see if you can balance things out a little bit better, but then you might end up with some stuttering on Wideview itself, because Wideview relies on sending very frequent position updates across the network in order to work, and if those updates slow down beneath a certain point, then the movement of the aircraft on the clients will no longer be smooth. You then have some options just to do with networking, so the socket number that will be used to do communication. By default it's 8000 and 8001 for Widetraffic. I never changed those. You could do, but I can't see any reason why you would need to, so you should probably leave those alone. Similarly with the buffers, I've tweaked that number and it doesn't seem to have any real effect for me. If your network communication is so slow that buffering is an issue, then you're probably going to have problems anyway. And let's face it, everybody these days has gigabit networking. That will not be a problem. You can see that because Wideview is quite an old product, well, let me rephrase that. Because Wideview's been around for a long time, it has settings to support things that really are no longer an issue. Like, for example, protocol use IPX. I don't know anybody still using IPX networking, and I don't think you even could on modern Windows, because Novell NetWare is dead. So everybody uses TCP/IP. To be honest with you, I would be surprised if Luciano doesn't take that option out fairly soon, because really I can't imagine anybody would want to use it. The update rate specifies the time slice that Wideview will use between sending network packets with location data. So by default it's 1 millisecond, and anything greater than that, if you go to 2 or 3, you will start to notice a little bit of sluggishness on the client, and you will notice things get a bit choppy because the positions are being updated too slowly, and so the aircraft is basically jumping from point to point. So I would leave that alone unless there's a really, really good reason for changing it. Similarly with the forced TCP/IP Nagel algorithm deactivation, I really have no idea what that does, and to be honest, it didn't do anything for me when I changed it, so I would just leave it as it is. There's configuration of the network interface. You can leave that as 0. pretty much anybody can leave that as 0 unless you've got a complicated network setup with multiple network interfaces, which I very much doubt you have. Just ignore it and leave it alone. Then there's some settings for which CPUs Wideview will run on. So by default, Wideview, and I believe Wideview is just a single threaded app. I don't think it uses multiple threads or can spread across multiple processors, but by default it will use the same core as the simulation. So if you have it single core, single CPU, single core, that's what will happen. Otherwise, you can specify as many cores as you like. I'm assuming it just picks one of those to run on at any given moment. It's a good way of keeping Wideview off a core that's saturated, where you don't want to give it any more work. So, for example, core 0 is probably going to be your main simulator thread, and it would probably be a good idea not to have Wideview on there. However, I haven't found any great practical performance difference by having it set as either single CPU or the way I've got it set now, and to be honest, I'm still experimenting with that to see what might or might not help. Then we've got some miscellaneous options that apply to both servers and clients. You can start Wideview automatically when the sim starts. That is the default. I've turned it off on my host machine, but I've still got it on my client machine. Spot plane mode, that is when Wideview will actually synchronize the state of things like the gear and the flaps and the rudder and the elevators and the aileron. So when you move those things on the host, the model on the client will receive that data and will actually move its control surfaces to match, which is what you would need if you were looking at the client machines in spot plane mode. Now, I can't imagine many people will want spot plane mode on the client machines on the outside views of their simulation, but you might do, and if you do, that's what you need to have checked. I have it checked. It doesn't really seem to affect performance despite the warnings, but if you're having issues, then of course you can turn it off. The next option lets you disable dynamic head movement. By default, P3D will do head acceleration when motion happens in the sim. So when you're in virtual cockpit view and you accelerate suddenly, then your view will change to simulate your head snapping back a little bit. In a sim setup where you've got a straight outside view, that is likely to be unwanted. So if you check that box, that will disable it. And that just amends the prepared.config file. You could do it yourself, but it's just as easy to get Wideview to do it. If you do change that setting, you will need to restart the simulator for that to take effect. And the same goes for the next option, disable annoying red text. So that basically just turns off the information text that you would otherwise ordinarily see. And then the last option here is to move the mouse pointer out of view on start. If you have a mouse pointer that hangs around and doesn't dismiss itself, and I don't imagine why you would, but if you did, and you didn't want it to appear and you didn't have a keyboard routinely connected to your client machines, you can send it off to coordinates that are outside the range of the screen and it will disappear immediately. The panel at the bottom has information on it about performance. So you can see number of cycles per second. That's the number of times Wideview is able currently to refresh itself per second. And then there's a checkbox underneath which is checked by default, and I would leave it when if the number of cycles per second is too low, and too low usually means lower than the frame rate of the sim, then you would activate the external booster, which is the additional executable that we noticed earlier on. And then there's some stats about number of packets sent and received, and whether or not IntelliSmooth is working. So IntelliSmooth is something I've left to the last minute. If we go up, back to the top of the dialog on the right hand side here, we've got client only options. So we wouldn't change any of those here on the host machine, but over here on the client we would. And the first of those is to use IntelliSmooth on the client. So IntelliSmooth is basically an algorithm that will try and guess where your position and attitude is going to change based on previous changes. So if the update rate drops down below the simulator frame rate, and it might do that if the sim is very, very saturated, then IntelliSmooth will generate additional network packets, additional update packets, continuing the maneuver that you were doing when the update rate dropped and hopefully try and fill in those gaps and make it as smooth as possible. I have IntelliSmooth on the client. It does get used. You can see at the bottom it says number of IntelliSmooth generated packets per second, 37. So it is generating some IntelliSmooth packets, and I need that on my setup in order to get smooth movement. I think because both the host and the clients are really pushed in terms of CPU, they're really pushed to the edge. You do need that option there, and I would recommend you have it checked and leave it turned on. Do not check the next one, which is lock to frame sync. Whatever you do, I find that if you do that, then you actually start to get lag in your client. So your host aircraft will move, and then the client machine will not move for possibly up to several seconds afterwards whilst it catches up. So don't do lock to frame sync. The manual will tell you more about this, so if you really want to understand it in great detail, then read the manual and it will give you detail. But I would generally tend to leave the settings pretty much as default and only change them if I felt that I really needed to. So that's my recommendation. To cancel out of those, you can see that the client is reloading again, because whilst we were in that dialog, the client was effectively on pause, and now it's synchronizing itself with the time back on the host, which has jumped forward on the host and has now jumped forward on the client, but that's caused the simulator to believe that it needs to reload the scenery. It's really annoying behavior on the part of Prepared that you only have to move a short distance or backwards or forwards a short distance in time, and it insists on reloading the entire scenery, which is really tedious, especially given that Microsoft Flight Simulator can do that instantaneously while you watch and while you drag a slider. So really think that's something Lockheed Martin should work on, but I guess it's probably an underlying feature of the FSX engine. Okay, so the client's reloaded now. So aside from the main configuration, we have weather options, we have view setup. So let's look at weather options. So Wideview will synchronize your weather between your host machine and your client machines if you want it to. Now, you might not want it to, and there are several reasons why you might not. If you're using an external weather program that has some kind of network client that will distribute the weather across multiple machines, then you would not have Wideview doing that for you, because it would be doing double duty. So for example, FS Global Real Weather, which has a network client, you would just use that on its own, and you would tell Wideview to not update the client's weather, which is the default option at the top of the page there. But if you are running an external weather program that does not work over the network, or alternatively, if you are setting weather themes manually, then you probably will want Wideview to do weather synchronization for you. And to do that, you have three options, well, four including weather themes. So from top left, by weather interpolation, that's where it brings together weather from multiple nearby stations and then synthesizes a global theme out of that. It gives you advice on which scenarios that's better for. So for example, best use for weather themes, no for real world weather, medium, but for user-defined weather setting or weather stations, yes. Then you have the option by multiple nearby weather stations, and those mean the weather stations are synchronized one by one, so it goes through the local weather stations within a certain distance, in this case 50 nautical miles, and it sets the weather station in each case on the client machine with the weather that it's gotten from the same station on the host machine. This does use a lot more network traffic and takes quite a bit longer to achieve. So again, it says best use is for real world weather or for individual specific weather stations being set by the user directly. The third option is by single specific weather station. So you can pick a particular weather station and it will then take that weather and set that weather globally. And then finally by weather theme. So you can pick one of the inbuilt weather themes, or you can use a weather theme you created yourself. If you do create your own weather theme, then you need to copy the star.wt file onto the client computer, because the same named file has to exist on all of the client machines as well as the host. And then you can pick a theme and Wideview will set that and keep it up to date. If you're using something like ActiveSky, as I do, you might wish to try and use the multiple nearby weather station setting. Unfortunately, at the moment in P3D v5, whenever the weather is updated, there is a flash on the screen. So it causes undocked windows to flash, and you can get sky flash on the main view. And if you set it up to happen frequently enough so that the weather can change on active sky on your host machine, and then your client machine picks it up in a short space of time, and we're talking still probably anything over a minute, you're going to be seeing very frequent flashes on the screen. So I am not doing that. I'm continuing to do what I did before, which is having two copies of Active Sky, one running on each machine, and then I just start them at exactly the same time so that the weather update cycle happens at the same time. Then usually the weather changes will synchronize within a few seconds of each other. So you can pick whichever works best for you or play about with it. I personally have not found that having Wideview synchronize my weather is the way I want to go. So I'm going to change it back to do not update client's weather via Wideview. But your mileage may, of course, vary. And lastly, view setup. So let's have a look at this dialog here. So Wideview can do some fairly clever things with your views, and back in the day when Wideview was really the only solution for doing these things, and you were looking to create multiple custom cameras on your different displays, these tools came in very handy, I suspect. However, in the modern era with P3D view groups and the ability to generate view frustums either automatically or completely manually, I think most of these options are actually a bit useless now. They certainly are useless to me. You could definitely go through them yourself and see if there was anything you wanted. This will, for example, let you move the... So, for example, if you pan the view on the host machine with the POV hat, you can have that reflected in your clients, but you have to give it all of the data on the different angles of the view so it knows how to calculate that. So, to be honest, not something that I would do. And equally, it can create custom views for you, custom cameras, but you wouldn't do that because you're using view groups. So basically everything on this screen I would leave alone, with one exception, and it's really the only reason that I'm covering it, which is this setting right here. Raise client's aircraft by n inches, as it says, prevent stutters on taxi. So the way that this software works and the way that OpenFSI works, and I presume the way that P3D multi-channel works, is by using something called user position freeze mode. So if we go into the options here, where is it? Yes, it's in positioning now. So you have these options. Slew mode, obviously, we know about. Position freeze user, position freeze all. Position freeze all will literally lock everything in place in the sim whilst allowing the time to continue to elapse. Position freeze user will freeze the user's object in place whilst everything else in the simulated world goes on without it. That's similar to active pause in the new Microsoft Flight Simulator. And the way that Wideview and other such packages works is by using SimConnect to put the user's vehicle into position freeze. Once it's in position freeze, the rest of the sim will continue to run, and then Wideview can send network data containing position information from the host to the client, and then the client will use SimConnect to tell the simulator what position and what attitude the aircraft should be at. And as long as it updates that frequently enough, then you get the illusion on the client machine that you are flying and moving in exactly the same way that you are on the host. Whereas in fact from the sim's perspective, you're actually stuck in place, just that place keeps getting updated on a very regular basis. So that means that most things that would happen in terms of physics in the sim to your user aircraft don't happen when you're in position freeze mode. However, there are some issues with the ground that can be a problem, and in particular on aircraft that have pretty loose suspension, particularly on the nose wheel. I've seen a phenomenon whereby if you pull up to a sharp stop and your nose dips as you would expect, then beneath a certain point the simulator assumes that you are I don't know, going to hit the ground or something like that, and Wideview resets the position, so you get a blip of the horizon. You may have seen that on some of my previous videos until I worked out exactly what it was. So this option is there to stop that. The idea being, if you bring the aircraft a few inches off the ground and it doesn't have ground contact, then the sim doesn't see it as being in contact with the ground, and you don't get these kind of interference effects. So I think by default it's 6 inches. I'm not sure why I've got it as 18 at the moment. You can see I've actually got it unchecked. So if I just cancel that dialog for a moment and we go into the spot plane view, you can see the wheels are touching the ground. And then similarly, if I do it here, you can see the wheels are touching the ground. In fact, if anything, they're actually slightly sunk into the ground. But if I go into the view setup menu and I say raise it by 6 inches and I check the box, now you can see that over there on the client, the airplane has actually risen up 6 inches above the ground. It looks a bit unnatural, but you wouldn't care unless you were using a spot plane view. If you make it too high, and you should experiment with values to see what works for you, but if you make it too high, then obviously it will actually affect the view out of the cockpit. So I could go to 1 inch, for example, and I don't know whether there's a minimum where I have to say okay. Let's try okay. Yeah, there you go. So 1 inch does nothing. 3 inches doesn't exhaust the reach of the suspension. I could keep going, but I know that 6 inches does work. And if you can get the suspension completely off the ground, which is why I was fiddling with sort of 12, 18 inches, then your wheels lift off the ground completely, and at that point you lose the ground effects. So that's worth knowing about, as it's something you may need to fiddle with if you get particular problems with your sim. If I go back into the cockpit views, there you go. You can see that's had no measurable effect on the view there, but if I went much higher, then it would. Well, I mean, you can see, because look, if you look here, there's a visible gap here, and here there isn't. It's horses for courses. You really should pick a setting that works for you, or turn it off if that works for you. But the option is there, and you need to know about it. That's pretty much it for the Wideview configuration. And we'll briefly cover wide traffic as well, why not? So wide traffic again is stopped here. I'll start it now, and that will start synchronizing the traffic. The configuration dialog doesn't look all that different. Similarly, some options are on the server only, some options are on the client only. You pick the role there. The network parameters, they may look depressingly similar to Wideview, except that the default setting for priority is normal. The default socket is 8001, the buffer's 10,000, or is that 100,000? 00, no, it's 10,000. These are all default settings. The interval is how many times per second Wideview will actually try and refresh the position of the AI objects. Now, that number has definitely got to be a balance between performance and load on the CPU. So the interval that you pick will determine to what extent AI traffic appears to stutter on its route. And you might be thinking, well, why is it stuttering at all? Well, the answer is that when you take over an AI aircraft over SimConnect and start dictating its position, then it loses the ability to follow any kind of course of its own accord. So now wide traffic is needing to keep refreshing the position of the AI traffic, just like it is refreshing the position of the user's aircraft on the client machine. But there's a lot more work involved in synchronizing the position of potentially dozens, maybe even hundreds of AI aircraft than there is just updating the position of one aircraft. So the number of times that you can do that every second is limited. The fewer times per second that you do it, the more time each individual AI model will spend waiting for the next update. And whilst it does that, it will literally be suspended where it is. So if you're updating 20 times a second, then you are likely to see some small stuttering where the AI traffic on the client appears to move not smoothly but in little jumps. The lower the interval, that you have, so the more frequently the updates are made, then the smoother things will become, but the greater the load is on the host machine. And my host machine is already pretty heavily taxed, so I found I can't really go below 20. I think the default may be 30. And that gives me the smoothest movement I'm likely to get, but it's still not perfect. If you're expecting perfectly smooth traffic, you probably need to get used to the idea that you won't have that. Again, you've got the options around the network interface, which you can ignore and just leave that parameter at 0. And again, you've got the choice of which cores you want to run the wide traffic process on. And also an option to start wide traffic automatically when the sim starts. And then on the right hand side, we have traffic parameters. And again, these are for the server only, so no point in changing these on the client. The first option, synchronize vehicles and other traffic in addition to aircraft. So wide traffic can actually synchronize road vehicles and boats and other things like that. And that sounds superficially attractive because it would give you a completely consistent world. Unfortunately, when you start adding all of that extra synchronization overhead, it starts to slow things down. And also, it doesn't do the world's best job of synchronizing the traffic. And to be honest, how often do you actually look at the traffic and worry too much about where it is? In my particular scenario, that doesn't matter because I only have one client machine and that's generating all of my outside views. But if you were, for example, in a situation where your host machine was also generating part of the outside view, then of course it might be more important to you to have those things synchronized. Not so much for road traffic, but maybe for boats and probably for airport vehicles, which will also be synchronized. And if you're thinking that this is a good backdoor way of getting GSX synchronized between machines, well, I can tell you it's not because I've tried. It does synchronize the GSX machines, the people, the marshallers, the passengers, the buses, and also the pushback truck. Whilst it does synchronize them and synchronize their position, what it doesn't do is synchronize their attitude. And so you end up with a pushback truck turned at 90 degrees to the front of your aircraft, which is kind of dragging along in front of you. And you get quite a lot of visual stutters as well. So it really doesn't work for synchronizing GSX, and I wouldn't even recommend trying it. You have an option to determine how far out from your position you want traffic to be sent. So in this case, the default is 5 nautical miles. I've got it set to 15 nautical miles. That means that you see aircraft that are flying high up a decent distance away, but not so far away that they actually wouldn't be visible in the sim. Static objects being any synchronizable AI plane or vehicle that is currently not moving. They only get refreshed every 60 seconds by default. When they transition from static to moving, then they will get picked up as moving objects and they will synchronize. So don't worry that a plane may push back and start moving and you've got to wait 60 seconds for that to show up on your client. That's not the case. And I wouldn't change any of these settings. The one thing I might change below here is the next option. So it explains a little bit about why. I'm not going to read all that out, but basically AI aircraft can be handled one of two ways. They can be handled as so-called intelligent shapes, or they can be handled as, well, dumb shapes. So dumb shapes need to be told by wide traffic exactly where they are at all times. Intelligent shapes can be given a direction and a speed and allowed to get on with things between updates. It's not the same as having an AI aircraft that will fly a course, but you can say head in this direction at this speed and it will go ahead and do that. The trouble with that is that an intelligent shape can get out of control of wide traffic in between synchronization. So I'll give you an example. I was taxiing up to T-junction and an EasyJet 737 was coming from the left to cross my path. And ATC ordered the 737 to hold position to let me past. And on the host machine, it dutifully stopped to allow me. But on the client machine, that aircraft just kept on rolling, and it rolled over the T-junction and beyond, and then it stayed there for a few seconds, and then it vanished and reappeared back where it was on the host. And that was wide traffic catching up with itself on the intelligent shapes. So intelligent shapes move more smoothly because they don't need to be updated every single time that they move, but at the same time you've got room for things to go wrong if they are asked to suddenly hold position, change course. The objects on the client machines may not do that and might take a little while to catch up, and that's beyond problems with things like ultimate traffic, where aircraft will arrive and disappear all of a sudden in place. It's the best of a bad job, I'd say. Somebody really needs to sort out the whole synchronizing AI traffic between machines deal, but it is a pretty complicated task, not helped by what the Sim and SimConnect can actually do. Be interested to see what Microsoft Flight Simulator has done in the way of potentially extending SimConnect in these areas. So you can choose whether to have all aircraft handled as intelligent shapes, but then you risk the problems that I'm talking about. Or alternatively, you can only have aircraft flying above a certain altitude as intelligent shapes. Note that dumb shapes don't actually show their visual effects. So as it says, things like smoke on touchdown, they're not active on dumb shapes. So as long as you're willing to lose that, then you can say, okay, as I've done, only aircraft flying above the altitude threshold will be handled as intelligent shapes. That gives us much better control of the aircraft on the ground, but it is a little bit more stuttery, a little bit more juddery. And the altitude threshold by default is 10,000 feet, and I've left it at that. And that is pretty much all the configuration that there is for both wide view and wide traffic. So once you have set things up the way that you want, you're pretty much ready to go. So any client machines will automatically synchronize with the host as soon as wide view and wide traffic are switched on both sides, and they will keep themselves in sync. If you move the host to a different location, then the client machines will follow. If you change the time on the host, the client machines will follow. If you have weather synchronization set up and you change the weather on the host machine, then the clients will pick up those changes. The one thing that it will not do is change your aircraft. So if I change to a different vehicle here, then the vehicle over here would not change. You might wonder why that is, because P3D multi-channel will change the vehicle for you. Well, two reasons. Firstly, Wideview just wasn't designed to do that. Wideview was designed for a very specific use case. It was designed to create one or more outside views on monitors, on networked machines, to supplement the host and to create the wraparound view that you're looking for. So it's really designed to function in this view. That is what Wideview is expecting. You can play with the zoom factor, of course, so you could zoom in, zoom out, but this is what the designers were expecting Wideview to actually be showing. So there was no expectation that you would have the virtual cockpit up, or that you would require any of the special effects in the virtual cockpit, or that you would care about synchronizing the position of switches in the virtual cockpit, with the exception of simple things like the basic lights, which do synchronize. So that would be cockpit lights, beacon light, nav light, taxi light, strobe light, and landing lights. Those will actually communicate across. But other lights, any special lights created by the aircraft itself, they will not. And Wideview is designed for that mode of use, not really for the use that, for example, I'm putting it to, where I have the virtual cockpit. So there are limitations there. And really, what you were supposed to do with Wideview was not to use the same aircraft on your Wideview clients that you actually use on your host. Wideview ships with a so-called dummy aircraft. And the dummy aircraft is what it sounds. It's an invisible aircraft that really does nothing other than just exist. And the idea is that you would switch to the dummy aircraft, and that would reduce the CPU usage on your client machines, versus if you were using a complex payware aircraft, for example. And you would still get the same effect because an outside view from a dummy aircraft is exactly the same as an outside view from any other aircraft. So only when you bring virtual cockpit infrastructure into the equation that thing breaks down. So if you're going to have a similar use case to mine where you want the virtual cockpit on screen, be aware of the limitations. It's not going to synchronize custom switches or gauges. It's not going to synchronize simulation variables. It's not going to move across events or the value of LVARs, etc. It's only going to synchronize the engine start events, the electrical system, and the lights. That's pretty much it. So that's pretty much it. There's no real complex config to do. You don't have to manually hack around with config files the way that you do with P3D multi-channel. You don't need to start the sim in any kind of weird mode the way you do with P3D multi-channel. It just works once you've got everything installed and you've set the options to the way you want them. Just to prove that it all works, and I'm not going to take a demo flight here. In fact, if you want to see how Wideview works in real-world flying, then have a look at any of my recent flight videos because they're all done using Wideview. But I will just push back the aircraft to show you that they both move at the same time. Now, bear in mind you're seeing both of these computers through VNC, so the frame rate you're seeing at the moment doesn't in any way reflect the frame rate that you'd see on the actual computer if you were sitting at it. But as you can see, the movement is synchronized, and that proves that Wideview is currently working. And I'll just stop there. Worth noting, by the way, that if you do have IntelliSmooth turned on, you do sometimes get a small lag between the client and the host. It's usually only a fraction of a second. If you find it annoying, and it can be a little bit annoying when you're trying to do rapid maneuvering, for example, on final approach, then you may need to turn IntelliSmooth off. The only problem with IntelliSmooth off is if the update rate drops too low, you might get some stuttering or you might get some loss of synchronization. But as always, play about, experiment, see what works best for you, and pick the settings that work best in your setup. Okay, well that's the video. I hope that was useful to you, and if you have any further questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll try to answer them as quickly as I can. If you have any other comments, then again, leave them in the comments below. If you like the video, please do hit the like button, it does help. If you didn't like the video, feel free to hit the dislike button. All feedback is gratefully received. And if you wanted to subscribe to the channel, I'd very much welcome you doing so, but I would suggest that you click the bell icon to get notified when I produce a new video, because the video schedule on this channel is a little bit irregular. In the meantime though, I look forward to seeing you back on the channel very soon.